Hello everyone, welcome to the Worldviews podcast. My name is Hansong Li. I'm a political theorist and intellectual historian. Here today I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Professor Piper Campbell. Professor Campbell was a diplomat for, I think, over 30 years. She was posted to various places and she was nominated by President Obama as the US Ambassador to Mongolia, and she was also heading the US mission to ASEAN. So today we're going to have a conversation on the changing world order, especially the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. So thank you so much for joining us, Piper.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to also be in this space. This is where we usually host our events at the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific Initiative. And we have some cultural relic here as well. And here is a gong right beside us. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of this gong? How did it end up in this space?
So the gong is a gift from the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia. It's relatively old. It's almost as old as the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific Studies Initiative. It was a gift from then Ambassador Pak Dino Jalal, who continues to be a great friend and supporter of the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific Studies Initiative. We're really proud that here at AU we actually created the first center or initiative focused on thinking about ASEAN and thinking about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and how the US-ASEAN relationship is and can be, should be.
That's wonderful, yes. And I also noticed this model of a fraught drum and that's Vietnamese, I think.
That's Vietnamese. We just recently hosted the Vietnamese ambassador here. We like to try to get as many ambassadors as we can to campus to have those interactions with students.
Yeah.
And that's both US ambassadors or former US ambassadors, but also foreign ambassadors serving in Washington. And so just within the last few weeks, we've had both the Vietnamese and Filipino ambassadors here on campus. And in fact, on Monday, we have the Kazakh ambassador coming.
That's fantastic, yes. And you were recently back from a trip to Korea, am I right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I wondered, I just came back from Japan, and you came back from Korea. I guess we can compare notes on the mood and the questions raised in the region. But may I ask, what were some of the puzzles that you wrestled with during your trip to Korea?
So I was in Korea as part of a Asia Pacific Leadership Network, APLN, US-China dialogue on Southeast Asia. And this is a multi-part process, which I've really enjoyed because it looks at how countries, especially countries of Southeast Asia, are dealing with increased US-China competition. And I think that hosting it in South Korea also allowed us to bring in more North Asian perspectives on that set of issues as well. So it was a wonderful conference where we had participants from China, from the US, countries throughout Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. It was a great opportunity to kind of do a pulse check, as I'm sure that you did in Japan yourself. And also, I've really been struggling with some of the things that I got wrong in terms of how I anticipated that the second Trump administration would approach diplomacy, and especially diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. And thinking through, given what we now know and understand about the likely path of this administration, what recommendations people like myself can helpfully, convincingly, usefully give to the administration, to others who are interested in Southeast Asia, who might not be in the administration, but also what advice to give to people of the region as well.
You were in Mongolia, and then you were in, I think you were heading the mission
in
Jakarta in 2018.
Yes.
So nowadays we talk about geo-legal spaces, geo-economic spaces in an increasingly fractured international society, and usually some of the blocks or spheres of influence being raised as examples are Eurasia and Indo-Pacific. So you kind of served in both regions, and there was this vast space in between Korea, Japan, China in the Northeast Asia, and then the entire ASEAN in the south. And I wondered, what were some of the shifts in your thinking on the region, and specifically on Trump 2.0? When I was attending a conference this time in Japan at Yamanashi University, we felt that there was a lot of anxiety from the region, a lot of questions were asked about the unpredictability going forward. And there was a sense there that it's not just a matter of a contingent presidential persona, but there are also deep trends within the US which produce this symptom and phenomenon, and then that will probably persist beyond this presidency, and that probably there is going to be a structural change in the international order. I wonder what you think about that assessment, and do you think there is something deeper and longer lasting, or do you think this is just a very short period in which we cannot see what is going to happen in the future?
I think it's longer lasting in a couple different ways. I think that there are aspects of the traditional international order, or we could say the World War II, post-World War II, or liberal order, that are breaking apart. And they are breaking not only because of Trump 2.0. In fact, I think you could kind of follow an argument that Trump 2.0 is as much a manifestation of the breaking as a cause of the breaking. But I would say that that is an aspect of what is going on. It is not the only aspect, but it is a key aspect. Something that I heard in South Korea, and I imagine it was similar to what you heard in Japan, was an uncertainty about what alliances in general, but especially the system of the hub and spoke alliance system built by the United States as part of the U.S. As part of U.S. foreign policy after World War II. Concern about the future of the hub and spoke alliance system, and what the United States understands and requires of allies, and what the United States commits to allies. I know we'll come back to things like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's recent travels to the Indo-Pacific, but I was certainly listening closely to his comments and his framing of alliances in both the Philippines and in Japan. I guess the other thing that I want to say about trends and things that I heard while I was in Seoul, and that I've been thinking about beyond just sort of this aspect of President Trump's impact on the international system, is a feeling that domestic politics in many countries is shaping foreign policy now more than ever. And so I think three interesting trends that intersect in so many complex ways, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about these a bit, would be sort of this fracturing of the liberal order. On that, I think it's really interesting that Marco Rubio, in a couple different interactions over the last couple weeks, has actually said that the United States would prefer a multipolar system. And that's a real change from U.S. policy over the last decades. So we've got sort of the structure of the system piece. We've got the question around the way countries interact with each other as friends, partners, and allies, and what are the commitments and requirements of those relationships. That's changing as well. And then the third piece is the change in terms of the impact of domestic politics on foreign policy, and the fourth would be the number of issues that aren't issues only or primarily at the state-to-state level. And so for such interesting dynamics, all intersecting at this moment. And I'd say in some really unique ways in the Indo-Pacific and in East Asia, which make that area so interesting right now.
Yes, indeed. And I was wondering, perhaps if we just do a thought experiment on the current state of the U.S. foreign policy and the theory behind it, if there is a theory at all, perhaps we can think historically about the fact that, as Rubio acknowledged, multipolarity has been the norm. If we look at it through the longue durée, thinking in thousands of years, certainly supremacy is a very rare thing, and the position the U.S. took post-World War II and then post-1990s after the breakdown of the Soviet Union was a historical contingency of some sort. We can think historically in that term, and we can also think historically and normatively about whether we'd like to live in a more multipolar world. But then there's also this strategic aspect to it. Could it be that there is also an art to the chaos that we see today? And just to think in the Trump terms, right? Is there a point there that perhaps Trump's position on Ukraine is some kind of Nixon 2.0 strategy to ally Russia against China? There, of course, I have a question that can you possibly alter the structures, right, over the past, I mean, we're not talking about over the past 4 years, but in the long making, the integration of the Russian and the Chinese policies economically, politically, and militarily, how can you alter that overnight? But perhaps that that is indeed a kind of strategic mindset shared by some people. So that's one thing I could think of. And the other thing is, Hegseth recently, during his trip, seemed to give this signal that he is harsh on Europe and elsewhere. Certainly in the Western Hemisphere, we see a kind of retreat of U.S. attention and refocus on the Western Hemisphere in a kind of renewed Monroe Doctrine. To some, it sounds like the U.S. is rebalancing, but then all the energies and resources and the rhetorical force are focused on China. Is there a sense that the U.S. is shrinking and pulling back, but then focusing on doubling down on China? So that's number two. And number three, do we live in a world where transactionalism simply prevails, right? Is it true that the Machiavellian maxim that it is better to be feared than to be loved does get you the outcome that we desire? So I wonder if there are any merits you would attribute to the foreign policy we see in Trump 2.0.
I think that Trump 2.0, foreign policy, or Trump 2.0 across the board, there absolutely is intent behind the chaos. This is chaos and disruption and destruction to purpose. And I think it's really important not to denigrate or diminish the intent behind the actions. I see Trump's foreign policy as being, in many ways, almost like a simpler, and by simpler I mean not complex, version of realism. It's very focused on the nation state as the actor. It is very focused on power with an extremely narrow definition or attention to what kind of power matters. And I think a range of his actions, whether we're talking about Greenland or Panama, are explained by a shifting away from a attention to systems and anything like an international legal order, and much more of a focus on physical territory, who holds physical territory, and what capabilities, especially in the military space, holding that physical territory gives you. I understand that the Department of Defense issued some guidance over the last month month and a half that the Washington Post had an article on just over the weekend, talking specifically about the Secretary of Defense's instruction to the Department of Defense that the Indo-Pacific is the primary theater. China is the primary actor within that theater. And then along the lines of what you were just mentioning, kind of this interesting combination of China and the Indo-Pacific as being, in many ways, the U.S.'s primary external focus, and the focus on the Western Hemisphere really, in many ways, being a domestic focus, being a focus on what threats to the United States does this administration perceive as coming from the Western Hemisphere.
No,
so in a way, it's almost like thinking about your offense and your defense.
That's very interesting. My question is, can we do multiple things at the same time, right? I mean, when Trump 2.0 tries to dismantle for example, the global economic structure that was in place since 1990s, and create these economic anxieties in the region, that does propel the 3 foreign ministers at the 11th trilateral foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo recently to push for further economic cooperation integration in Northeast Asia between China, Korea, and Japan. But of course, we can have headsets going into the region and assuring our allies we're upgrading our command, we are doubling down on the strategy against China.
Deterrence all day, all night, all the time.
So, you promise a lot on security, but of course then you disrupt the economic fabric, right, of this regional order. I mean, do those things how do they square against each other?
Well, this is a bit what I was referring to, or aligned with what I was referring to, where my sense of President Trump's foreign policy is that the measure of power is so much in the measure of force, the measure of military, which I find surprising given some other aspects of President Trump as an individual, right? A businessman, and yet he seems willing to take some actions. He has expressed willingness to take actions in the short term, especially related to tariffs, acknowledging the impact, the negative impact those are going to have on the U.S. economy. So it's not leading with our economic power. Also, as somebody who previously was a television personality, he does not seem to place tremendous value in sort of what Joseph Nye called soft power, public diplomacy, reputational strength. Many of his actions, especially with foreign audiences, have had the impact of lessening the U.S.'s reputational power. So those are some of the things where I'm still trying to figure out the logic. But I think if you follow the logic which says that primary measure of power is military and security, then one can see how you can pursue one set of objectives in the security space that have negative impacts in the economic space, and you might lessen your sense of the importance of the economic costs if you've achieved your security objectives.
And in our time of very fluid and mobile movement of ideas and institutions, and is it really possible to have a geospatialized strategy? Just when I think about the intertheatric perspective from the Heritage paper and from Hegseth himself, I think when you give up certain theaters to focus on this particular theater, of course your primary presupposed adversary are going to also prevail in the other theaters.
And look at the attention that the administration is having to apply to the Houthis right now. So if you read the strategy, if you were following the strategy that had been put out just within the last month, those do not seem to be the actions or the attention that you'd be applying in that theater. So it does seem that the aspiration to lessen attention in the Middle East, to lessen attention in Europe, and to goad our European allies to pick up more of the load in Europe. And I'm not quite sure who's meant to pick up the load in the Middle East. Yeah. But that idea doesn't seem to be playing out in actions at this 8th, 9th week, wherever we are.
Very interesting that,
I guess,
the guiding principle and the action are not always congruous either, right? It's very hard to
I think we could say that's one of those facets of foreign policy. I think it would be, in reality, when you look around the world and you look over time, I think it would be more unusual to find a country that had set a policy and been able to follow it consistently. And by consistently, I actually mean like 4 to 8 years, not a decade, but had been able to set a policy and follow it over an extended period of time. There's a reason so many countries revise their strategies every 4 years, every 5 years, every Congress.
Yeah, just the constant inconstancy is a trademark of foreign policy. We offered a charitable interpretation of the Trump 2.0 foreign policy, and now I wondered when I read your 2024 paper and your recommendations on ASEAN. I saw that you suggested that we avoid self-inflicted wounds. I wonder now, perhaps wearing a more critical hat, what are some of the self-inflicted wounds that you are warning us against at the moment?
It's interesting because I wrote that paper in the summer of 2024 at a time when it was not clear which party would secure the U.S. presidency. And I really was trying to write it in a way that the recommendations would apply to either party. And yet, only 3 months into the Trump administration, I can sit down and see how badly I missed the mark if my intent was to communicate recommendations that this administration would pick up. When I referred to self-inflicted wounds, that was really coming from my understanding of the interests of the countries of Southeast Asia. And preeminent among those is to maintain agency. To maintain agency and to maintain the flexibility to interact with China and the United States. And that may be interacting with China more in the economic space while having a strong security relationship with the United States. So it's not, we see the countries of Southeast Asia doing something we were just discussing a moment ago, which is choosing different partners for different aspects of their policy approach. And the countries of Southeast Asia feel this is very important. They would like more economic engagement with the United States. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a prior U.S. administration's recognition of, among other things, it was a recognition of the interest in the demand signal coming from the region. And I know very few people who really seriously look at the U.S. Southeast Asia relationship and are okay with the minimal level of trade engagement between the United States and Southeast Asia. Most people who are really focused on Southeast Asia would like to see more, would dream of the U.S. re-engaging, for example, in CPTPP. But realistically, that's not going to happen. it was clear neither administration was going to do that. So in a way, when you start talking about self-inflicted wounds, in a way, the first self-inflicted wound is choosing not to engage economically in Southeast Asia, which is such a dynamic, such an important region, and it's going to be more important moving forward. But if we accept that, if we kind of take a fair amount of the trade off the agenda, there's still some things we can do in trade, and we're seeing U.S. companies in many ways actually taking the lead in the commercial space, in the trade space. So when I think about other self-inflicted wounds we can avoid, I think the headline would be, don't make the countries of Southeast Asia choose. Don't push them into a corner. That would be my advice, but that is not advice that's going to resonate with the Trump administration, because you referred to kind of this transactional approach. This administration has a comfort in pressing, has displayed a comfort in pressing others, right? And so this is where I'm doing a lot of thinking right now, because it wouldn't make any sense for me to go and engage with the Trump administration and lead with a don't make them choose. So
your other recommendation is the bottom line, not to cede the region to China.
Yes.
So I have a question on that.
Okay.
And just as a moment ago, I was trying to offer a Trump perspective on foreign policy to elicit your response, I would like to give perhaps two kinds of challenges, perhaps from China, perhaps from other partners in the region. One is that I think you encountered this counter paper in Korea, right? That perhaps, yes, there is an Indo-Pacific region that we are contending and contesting, but China could offer an alternative set of security measures and guarantees. And at least if you are envisioning a space of free choices, then to what extent, right, the U.S. should be okay with the countries in the region also mixing different security engagements between China and the U.S.? That's the first question. And the second question is a less aggressive challenge. But I think in the long term, it is a very big question, because if this is a space for free mutual hedging, and you have mentioned in the past, citing various scholarships, that perhaps hedging is not the best scenario, but it's the second best scenario, so we should allow and indeed encourage regions to hedge between great powers, and that also increases spaces for their agency. But the question then is, now we do see China not just as a geopolitical contender in territorial terms, but a normative power in some sense, and it's gaining momentum in offering all kinds of technologies, goods and services, even ideas and cultural goods, and in cultural diplomatic terms. So if China simply has more to offer in the free market of hedging and choosing, then would it be possible that China floods the market with more interesting things at a time when the US is looking increasingly inward and doesn't have as much in that space? So would the hedging lead to a scenario where we are not coming out on top, or we are ceding the ground in the aftermath of the hedging?
We're flooding the market, or the U.S. is flooding the zone and China's flooding the market, both at the same time. What I find interesting is, I have to give all credit to Malaysian scholar Cheng Chui Kwek, who talked about hedging as really this second best, not necessarily the strategy desired by either the United States or China, but a strategy that might be the best for everybody, the best that we can get. And I continue to believe that. And so this is the space where I'm thinking through, how do you make that argument to this administration? And how do you make it to China as well? To to give Southeast Asia this room, and that an ASEAN-centered area, ASEAN-led mechanisms, that there are reasons for actually supporting that and not just giving it lip service. I would say that I have definitely seen instances where China has given things like ASEAN-led concepts more lip service than real respect. And I think when you look, for example, at the remarks of Philippine Secretary of Defense Teodoro following the interactions with Secretary of Defense Hegseth, he talked about, he and his Japanese counterpart, I was really interested, I was listening for both of them, how they talked about China as well as how they talked about the United States. And one phrase that jumped out at me was malign and unwanted actions in the region. And that's a careful and diplomatic reference to China. And so while I see China engaging with the region in so many areas that the region needs and wants, we also see China taking actions right now that are worrying the region, and that the region is very comfortable to raise privately and also, I'd say, increasingly publicly, when in Japan and in the Philippines there's multiple references to the importance of international law, the importance of respecting references to the South China Seas, reference to, I didn't hear a reference to UNCLOS specifically, but it is clear that there are a set of Chinese actions that are worrying Japan, that are worrying the Philippines, worrying others in the region. And that's before we even bring Taiwan into the conversation.
Right.
So I do think those are some of the key dynamics that are shaping the anxiety that you and I both heard in and from the region.
Yeah, and that's coming out in the recent trip that the head said is there to reassure those allies. And on the other hand, I wonder if when we talk about Malaysia and Indonesia, right, and this is a conversation that we had with Andrew Harrop, we had at the Malaysian embassy as well, that came up a few times, the question that on the one hand, there are liberal international norms, and that's the theater where we just talked about, Philippines and Japan. And then there are also rising discourses in cultural politics and civilizational politics, especially the role of religion. And Southeast Asia being as diverse and dynamic as it is, it has so much in that respect. And there's so many normative contestations going on at the time. And one is Islam. And that's how we kind of connect the Southeast Asian part of the world with also the Middle East and North Africa. Given the situation around global Islam, right, do you think Malaysia and Indonesia will present some challenges in this picture of, well, maybe not peaceful, but at least contested, collaborative hedging? And will the two countries stand out as a challenge? And what role do you see them play in the region and more broadly?
The Biden administration used this term of lattice work. And I actually wrote a piece saying that because people don't really know what a lattice work is, that it diminishes the impact, and that I think it makes much more sense to talk about a multinodal network, all the different ways that the countries of the region are connected to each other, as well as connected to the world. When I think about Southeast Asia, yes, certainly you have Malaysia and Indonesia and the connections via religion to the Middle East, North Africa. I think that the Malaysians have talked about trying to have an ASEAN GCC summit during their ASEAN chair year. Somewhat strangely, I understand there's also been proposals of a ASEAN GCC plus China summit, and I find myself in the area of ideas, really sort of scratching my head as to what set of cultural norms or ideas might shape that particular discussion if it does move forward. But I also think that a strength of Southeast Asia is the diversity of the countries within it. And so, yes, Malaysia and Indonesia are both Muslim countries, in many ways quite different from each other as countries, and even in terms of the role that the Muslim religion plays within the intent and structure of the countries. Indonesia, of course, has their Pancasila and the emphasis on unity and diversity. And in a way, I almost think that that's also the concept that really underlines ASEAN as well, this unity and diversity, because the countries of Southeast Asia have, when you really come down to the cultural aspect, there are similarities, but there's also so many differences between them.
A recurring motif throughout our conversation and throughout many previous conversations on Southeast Asia is the space of agency for Southeast Asia that is not just a space stuck between China and the US, but it has its own ideas. I wonder, I was thinking about this thing that Ted Osius said during our event at the Malaysian embassy. He said that Southeast Asia and ASEAN institutionally should also be a norm creator, a norm giver, and not just as a norm receiver. What would you say are the fronts on which Southeast Asia could offer norms and not just receive and implement them in the kind of typical way we read post-1990s liberal world order, right? We usually criticize it by saying, well, it is created by some parties, by the so-called international society. Many are excluded, and that's the chief grievance, I would say. China, India sometimes would give, right? We were not part of the founding moment of the institutions, and now you just kind of expect us to follow everything. But Southeast Asia were also not really included as norm makers at that point. Now, if things are shifting, are there also spaces for them to come in and say, here are our ideas, and perhaps when we maybe not refound, but at least revise some of the international norms, those can come in. Do you see that? And if so, where do you see that?
And so this was a comment former U.S. Ambassador Ted Osius, now CEO of the US-ASEAN Business Council, made. And I would completely agree and endorse the idea. I think that it's not a role that ASEAN has been particularly comfortable or eager to take in the norms space. However, we've seen them do it successfully in the economic space within the economic pillar of the ASEAN work. And thinking, in addition to Ted, thinking about our colleague Amitav Acharya, certainly in his writing about regionalism, he'd be right there with Ted in talking about the space, not the space, but the importance of ASEAN being a norm setting, choosing to be and recognizing its ability to be a norm setting institution. I have two really diametrically different answers. The first is ASEAN is such a young, the countries of ASEAN, one of their great strengths is their youth. And the demographic dividend we're going to see accruing to Southeast Asia at a time when we can't really say that about many other regions of the world. And so I would love to see these young voices of Southeast Asia be part of this next generation of norm setting. As the head of the U.S. mission to ASEAN, I was very much engaged with the Young Southeast Asians Leadership Network, YSEALI, and I can tell you there are amazing young people in Southeast Asia. So I think it's not so much, maybe it's you still have black hair, I have gray hair. It's not for me or for the people who were involved in the last rounds of norm setting to necessarily be saying where the next areas for norm setting should be. I would love to see those voices, the voices of the youth. And by youth, I really mean, like, I don't mean, well, it certainly can be teenagers, but the people in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, speaking up about, thinking about the world they want to live in. So that's one answer. That's the more idealistic answer.
That's very interesting, because just like in constitutional philosophy, we say that every generation, maybe in an institutional way, maybe in a softer way, deserves this kind of rethinking of the kind of polity they want to live in. This is a bit kind of deep Jeffersonian thinking, which goes back to the Enlightenment. Perhaps we can also think about it that in terms of international norms, that every generation can create its own space for thinking what kind of world order they want to live in. So that is very interesting, how you think about this intergenerationally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Then the other one, the much more mundane, is an area where ASEAN is setting norms, is in the digital economic frame, and setting negotiating this year a digital economic framework agreement. And this is, it's a very concrete example of something that they're doing in their regional bloc that nobody else is doing. Nobody else has managed to do negotiate a high standard, look at framework like this, thinking about the digital economy. And when we think about the future, there are so many aspects of disruptive technology, of cybersecurity, of the digital economy. So much of the next round of international norm setting is going to have to be around what are the international norms about AI, etc. Yeah. So I'm pleased to see ASEAN taking some norm setting leadership there.
Yeah, the sheer volume of digital economic activities there now, and also this future of innovative entrepreneurial activities in the region, right? That's the future clusters and centers of innovations. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I guess you mentioned at one point that perhaps we are heading to a more regionalist world order, and I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that. In what sense are we talking? What kind of regionalism are we thinking about? Are we thinking about a revised and reformed international society in which regions take more active roles, or are we thinking about a world divided into regions? Because we see, I mean, even in academia, but certainly in public discourses, this renewal of interest in old ideas, Großraum sometimes, that perhaps it is normatively, historically and normatively the case that we live in a world of different living spaces where great powers dominate, and that is no longer a kind of outdated theories as we saw it in the 1990s and early 2000s. So what kind of big picture world order do you envision in the future?
Well, the first part of my answer would be if we are moving into a multipolar world, then arguably that means 3 or more poles. And perhaps poles tend to a certain extent, be geographically grouped. So very few people talk about poles and regions as being synonymous, but I think there could be some interesting conversation there. But the way I think about regions, one of the key ways that I think about regions is in looking at all the aspects of the human experience that are not naturally contained within a nation state. And so if we talk about US, Canada, and Mexico, those 3 countries, they're not a region per se, but we talked about how this administration is certainly looking at the US, Canada, and Mexico, looking at the Western Hemisphere as a source of threats to the US domestic situation. I don't think so much about threats as this administration does. That's not necessarily my focus. But I think that one of the key aspects of regions is the tendency of the flow of people, of ideas, of the meshing of cultures, of the economic aspects of countries and peoples who are co-located. And so that's, for me, one of the key and interesting aspects of regions and thinking about regions.
So Piper, we see so many opposing trends, right? On the one hand, we see that international affairs have become more geospatialized and become more transactional. On the other hand, even at these moments, perhaps especially at these moments, the world has become more entangled. So it's very difficult to see our own spaces in isolation from the others. So perhaps it's an open question for us, and we'll see what happens in the next few years.
Yes, it could be Trump 2.0 changes the world. At the same time, I think we need to anticipate that the world and so many different aspects and dimensions of international relations are going to change Trump 2.0.
That's wonderful. And on that note, let's bring it to a close. And our podcast is called Worldviews. We have indeed discussed many different worldviews, right? We have brought in different interpretations of what's happening in the US, and we are looking at regional views from Southeast Asia, from Northeast Asia, and we're going to have more conversations in the series, and perhaps your other colleagues can reference our discussion in our future iterations. And may I actually invite you to strike the dawn to bring our dialogue to an end?
That would be my pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
And that is our conversation with Piper Campbell, and we'll see you at our next episode.